What do you do when your spouse refuses to meet your sexual needs? That's coming up today on The Beat. Hey my friend, welcome back to The Beat. My name is Parr. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, it's a pleasure. If you want a free ebook, click the link in the description box below. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing, hit that little bell notification so you won't miss a beat. Okay, so let me start off by saying this. If you are a teenager or you are a single person watching this video, I would probably encourage you to actually turn the video off because this is not a video that's designed for singles or those who are young, because there's some information in here that is specific to married couples only. So I'm gonna give you a second to turn this video off before I move forward. Turn it off. Okay, so this issue is way more common than you may actually believe. You have some couples that are in what's called a sexless marriage, and this is when both couples have basically decided, hey, sex is not important to us. We want to focus in on the friendship. We don't have a desire for each other nor anyone else outside of the marriage. But then you have this other couple that one person is suffering immensely in pain, normally in silence, having nobody to talk to because their partner is refusing to meet their sexual needs. So in this video, I want to do three things. First of all, as always, I want to look at what the Bible actually has to say on this topic, because God does have something to say about it. And then second of all, I want to give you some practical things that you do not want to do if you're in a situation where your spouse is refusing to meet your needs. And then third, I want to give you a couple of things that I want to encourage you to do that may help improve the situation. Okay, so we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. But in order to understand this, it's important that I give you a little bit of background, a little context here. So Paul is writing to a group of Christians located in the city of Corinth in this church that is comprised of both Jews and Gentiles. Now, the Jewish culture was much more self-controlled in terms of its experience and view in sex. Oh, but the wild Gentile culture, man, they were so wild. They were used to having casual sex. As a matter of fact, even in the city of Corinth, there was this temple of Aphrodite, and in this temple, there was legalized prostitution. In other words, it was generally accepted in that day for a married man, to give honor and worship to this goddess by having sex with prostitutes. This was the culture in which Paul was writing to the city of Corinth, and he's getting ready to give them these instructions on sex. Beginning in verse 1, Paul says this: "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." So the first point that Paul makes here is this: it is possible to live a celibate life. I want you to notice here that he says it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now we're going to be doing a lot of Greek in this particular study, and so the first word I want to bring to your attention is the word touch, which is the Greek word hapto, which means to light or kindle a fire inside of a woman. So he says it is good for a man not to light a fire in a woman, to touch her with the intent of having sex with her. And so Paul is basically saying that living a celibate life is a good thing. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say in verse 7 that it is possible, because he says, I'm doing it myself. He says, I wish that everyone could be single and celibate like me, but everybody has their own gift. So the point is this: if you are in a marriage where your spouse is refusing to meet your needs, this does not give you the right to go outside of the marriage and meet your needs because your wife or your husband is not meeting your needs, because God says that it is possible to live a celibate life. Now, the second thing that I want to encourage you to do if your spouse is refusing to meet your needs is to take a good look at yourself first before you start to place the focus on your spouse. I want you to notice what verse 3 says: the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Now, once again, let's go to the Greek. This word fulfill is actually what's called an imperative in the Greek language, which means it is a strong command. He says this is not a suggestion. He says, I am commanding you to fulfill this. Now, the next Greek word we want to look at is the word duty, and this is a word that means an obligation or a debt. So basically he's saying whenever you come into the marriage, you have an obligation, you have a debt to fulfill to meet your wife's sexual needs and vice versa. So the first thing you need to look at if your spouse is not interested in having sex with you, or they're refusing you from having sex, is, am I making sex all about me, or am I making their enjoyment of the sexual act the highest priority in my life? Listen, if sex is one-sided and it's always about you and you getting your needs met, well then think about it for a second. Why in the world would they even be interested and excited about having sex with you if they know that they're not going to get anything out of it in return? And so you need to make sure that you're making their sexual needs the first priority, and then and only then may you actually get the needs that you want to get met back in return. Maybe we as husbands need to focus on non-sexual touch, meaning touching our wives and being affectionate with them so that every time we touch them, they don't think that we're trying to make a beeline into the bedroom. And in this way, we're focusing on meeting her non-sexual needs, which may result in her having a desire to meet our needs as well. And likewise, ladies, men also have a need and desire for affection as well. Now, for the next couple of points, I want to talk specifically to the spouse that is making the conscious decision to refuse your spouse sexual desires. I want you to notice what Paul says next in verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And Paul is basically saying this: whenever you say I do, you are relinquishing total control over your body. You can no longer say that this body belongs to me, you do not have access to this. He says you are making the decision to give your spouse access to your body, assuming that there is nothing going on like sickness and disability or different things like that. Certainly there may be exceptions. I'm not talking about 100% of the time, but generally speaking, this person has access to your body because your body belongs to them and their body belongs to you. Now, the verse that I've really been itching to get to is verse 5, and basically Paul's point here is this: if celibacy outside of marriage is right, celibacy inside of marriage is wrong. Notice what it says here. It says stop depriving one another. Once again, in the Greek, that word deprive is a verb, and it's basically an imperative saying stop doing this. He says if you're not doing it, then don't start. If you are, you need to stop depriving one another. That word deprive means to default on something or to defraud someone. In other words, you're taking something away from someone else that belongs to them. Paul then gives one exception in your marriage where you may decide not to have sex, but there are some specific conditions that you have to follow. First of all, he says except by agreement. That Greek word agreement is the word symphonos, from which we get our English word symphony. So when you think about a symphony, that means that everyone is in agreement. So if you and your spouse agree that you're going to take some time and not have sexual relationship with each other, that should be the only time in your marriage where sex is not happening. The second condition is not only do you have to both agree on this, but it says for a time. Now, in the New Testament, there are different words for time. One is the word chronos, from which we get our word chronology, but the Greek word here is the word kairos, which means a relatively short period of time. So Paul's saying this isn't something that's just open all the time and says, hey, we're just going to not have sex indefinitely. I'll get back to you whenever I'm ready. He says, no, it should be a set specific time with a start and an end, and it should be a relatively short period of time. And then third, there should be a specific purpose for why you're choosing to be celibate for this relatively short period of time once you both agree, and that is if you have a specific purpose. It says here, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. So if you're not praying around the clock, if you're not fasting, if you don't have something that you're trusting God for together in your marriage, Paul says you should be having sex. And then finally, Paul says after this time has elapsed, he says, come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. God says, I have designed sex to be something beautiful, something to knit and connect two people in a covenant relationship in marriage together. So whenever you make the conscious decision, please listen to me, to deny your spouse the sexual desires that God says belong to them, then what you're doing is you are willingly putting that spouse in a place where they're going to be very vulnerable to the attacks of the enemy, because the text says that we by nature lack self-control. So the longer that you go on, you're basically sabotaging your own marriage by putting your spouse in a place that they are vulnerable to the attacks of the devil. And the question I would ask you is this: why on God's earth would you want to sabotage your own marriage? Making the conscious decision to refuse your spouse their sexual needs is not only sinning and going against a direct command in Scripture, but it is also very selfish as well. So with all of that being said, what are some things that you should not do if your spouse refuses to have sex with you? For the first thing, you don't want to pout. pouting is not going to get it better. Simply say, hey, we haven't had sex in 3 weeks or a month or whatever. That's not going to make the situation better. The second thing you don't want to do is blame. You don't want to say, well, it's because of you, and it's because of this or that you're doing that we're not having sex. Once again, you're not focusing on the solution. You're just bringing up the problems and placing blame. The third thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to start watching pornography, because now you are just as sinful as that other person, because you're not doing things that will contribute to bringing yourself together. Instead, you're basically going off and saying, I don't need you anymore to get my sexual needs met. I have another option. Fourth, you don't want to pull away emotionally, because once again, that's not bringing you closer together. Fifth, you don't want to have an affair. And then finally, you don't want to get a divorce, because as difficult as it may be, there is no scripture, there's no ground for divorce in the Bible that says that if your spouse is not meeting your sexual needs, then you have the right to go elsewhere and end the marriage. So finally, you are stuck. Your spouse refuses to have sex with you. They refuse to even talk about it. They refuse to get counseling. They refuse to get help. What are some things that you can do? Well, the first thing that you want to do, if they are open to talking about it, is try to discern whether there's something else going on in your relationship or in this person's personal life that may contribute to them having a lack of desire for sex. This could be anything from them experiencing some sort of hormonal change, or maybe it's something from their past that they haven't dealt with that they need to talk about and get counseling for. There could be some interpersonal issues in your relationship that are causing resentment and hostility, that's causing an emotional disconnect between the two of you, which is causing them not to want to connect with you. There could be some sort of self-confidence or body image issue that's going on in their lives that's hindering them from feeling confident enough to connect with you. Maybe they don't feel confident how they look, and so they're afraid to actually connect sexually with you. It could be a physiological change going on. And then finally, I know we don't want to hear this, but there could possibly be something that has changed about us physically, drastically, that is causing our spouses to no longer be attracted to us, which means we want to do our best to try to address that so that we can be as attractive and as appealing to our spouse as possible. So I wish I had some better advice if you feel stuck sexually in your marriage, but let me encourage you in this. When you said I do, you said some vows. You said for better or for worse. Well, my friend, this would be in the category of for worse. These are some difficult situations that we have to deal with. There is no scripture, once again, that says that I can bail and get out of the marriage. I have to endure. I have to love this person as Christ loved the church. One key quality of any successful relationship is making the conscious decision to love the other person even when you are not getting anything in return. If you found this video helpful in any way, feel free to share it with a friend. Also, if you haven't done so already, I would love it if you would subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time on The Beat.